Castles may sound grand, but their stone floors didn't care about your spine. Forget the royal dreams. Most folks inside medieval fortresses slept on damp straw near drafty walls. And beneath ceilings that echoed every creak tonight, we lie down not in luxury, but in the cold truth of what it really meant to rest inside a castle. If slow-burning tales of forgotten discomforts help you wind down, you've come to the right place. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon for more cozy dives into the hidden corners of history's bedtime. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. Picture, if you will, the Great Hall of Goodrich Castle in the year 1295. The massive timber beams stretch overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast, disappearing into shadows that dance with the dying firelight. The stone walls, thick enough to withstand a siege, emanate a constant chill that seeps through the finest wool and fur. As the evening meal concludes and the trestle tables are dismantled and stacked against the walls, you witness a transformation that would seem impossible to our modern sensibilities. This grand ceremonial space, where important business was conducted and great feasts were held, becomes a communal bedroom. The reality of medieval castle sleeping arrangements was far removed from the romantic notions we might harbor today. In the Great Hall of Goodrich Castle, nearly 100 servants lived and worked under the watchful eye of Countess Joan de Valence. As darkness fell, this impressive space, with its soaring ceiling and massive fireplace, became a shared dormitory where social boundaries blurred in the most intimate of ways. The Great Hall served as the heart of castle life, functioning as dining room, courtroom, reception area, and at night, a sprawling bedroom for dozens of inhabitants. Isaac, of the kitchen, whose daily responsibility included preparing 2 meals for up to 200 people, would have been among those seeking rest on the hall floor each night. After spending his day in the sweltering kitchen, managing the complex logistics of feeding a small army, he would emerge into the Great Hall as the evening shadows lengthened. The transition from his domain of fire, smoke, and culinary chaos to the communal sleeping space must have been both a relief and a continuation of his servitude. For even in rest, there was no escape from the constant presence of others. The floor beneath their bodies was not the polished wood or elegant stone we might imagine. In ground floor halls, the surface was often beaten earth, sometimes stone, occasionally plaster materials chosen for durability rather than comfort. When the hall was elevated to an upper story, timber flooring became more common. But even this represented little improvement in terms of sleeping comfort. The medieval concept of flooring was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. These were not surfaces designed for human comfort, but rather utilitarian foundations that could withstand the daily traffic of hundreds of feet, the movement of heavy furniture, and the inevitable spills and accidents of communal living. The preparation for nighttime rest began as soon as the evening meal was cleared. Servants would emerge from storage areas carrying bundles of rushes tall, grass-like plants that had been harvested from nearby wetlands, dried, and woven into mats. These rush mats, along with loose rushes scattered directly on the floor, formed the primary bedding for the majority of castle inhabitants. The rushes served multiple purposes. They provided a minimal barrier between human bodies and the cold. Hard floor, they absorbed moisture and helped control odors, and they could be easily replaced when they became too soiled or worn. The social hierarchy of the castle remained visible even in the arrangement of these sleeping spaces. At the upper end of the Great Hall, separated by nothing more than a curtain, or in more prosperous times, a wooden partition, the noble family would arrange their sleeping area. The lord and lady might have a proper bed frame of wood, with ropes woven across to support a mattress stuffed with feathers or down. This elevated sleeping arrangement, while still lacking privacy by modern standards, represented the pinnacle of medieval sleeping luxury within the communal space. The curtain, that separated the noble family from the rest of the castle folk was a flimsy barrier at best. Made of heavy fabric, it provided visual privacy but no acoustic isolation. Every whisper, every intimate conversation, every private moment of the lord and lady was audible to those lying just feet away on the rushes. Conversely, the noble family was constantly aware of the presence of their servants, soldiers, and other household members. The concept of privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in these medieval sleeping arrangements. As the last embers of the great fireplace began to die, the hall would fill with the sounds of people settling for the night. The rustle of straw and rushes, the whispered conversations, the occasional snore or cough, and the constant shifting of bodies seeking comfort on the unforgiving floor created a symphony of human habitation that continued throughout the night. The air grew thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, the herbal strewing that had been mixed with the rushes, the lingering aromas of the evening meal, and the ever-present dampness that characterized these stone structures. The servants and soldiers who composed the majority of the hall's nighttime population had developed their own strategies for comfort and survival. Those fortunate enough to possess a rough woolen blanket would wrap themselves tightly against the cold. Others relied on their daily clothing, their cloaks, tunics, and whatever other garments they owned to provide warmth. The concept of special sleeping attire was foreign to all but the wealthiest inhabitants. People slept in their day clothes, removing only their outer garments and shoes. The positioning of bodies on the hall floor followed an informal but understood hierarchy. Those with higher status among the servants, the steward, the head cook. The marshal might claim positions closer to the fireplace, where residual warmth could be felt even after the flames had died. The lowest-ranking servants, the scullions and general laborers, would find themselves relegated to the coldest, most uncomfortable corners of the hall, furthest from any source of heat and most exposed to the drafts that constantly swept through. The castle, the great hall's windows, if they existed at all, were small and set high in the walls. Glass was a luxury beyond the reach of most castle builders, so these openings were covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or simply left open to the elements. Even when covered, they provided little barrier against the cold and the constant drafts they admitted meant that no corner of the hall was truly protected from the outside temperature. The medieval saying "cold as a castle" was not merely metaphorical, but reflected the harsh reality of stone construction in an age without central heating, but perhaps the most challenging aspect of sleeping in the great hall was not the physical discomfort, but the complete absence of personal space and privacy. In a world where individual rights and personal boundaries were concepts that had yet to be born, the sleeping arrangements of the Great Hall represented the ultimate expression of communal living. Every person who lay down on those rushes was acutely aware of the presence of others, their breathing, their movements, their dreams, and their nightmares. As you contemplate this scene, one question emerges from the smoky darkness of the medieval night. What did it mean to rest when rest itself was a communal act? And how did the human spirit adapt to a world where solitude was not merely uncommon, but virtually impossible? Answer to how medieval people adapted to communal sleeping lies in understanding that their entire worldview was shaped by collective existence. Privacy was not a lost luxury, but rather a concept that had not yet been invented. The men and women who lay down on the rush-covered floor of the great hall each night had grown up in a society where personal space was measured in inches rather than feet, where the boundaries between self and community were fluid and constantly negotiated. The daily rhythm of castle life prepared its inhabitants for the communal sleeping experience. From the moment they woke until the moment they closed their eyes, every aspect of their existence was observed, supervised, and shared. The kitchen. Servants who worked under Isaac of the kitchen labored shoulder to shoulder in cramped spaces, sharing tools, tasks, and the constant pressure of preparing meals for hundreds of people. The idea of retreating to a private room at the end of the day was as foreign to them as the concept of individual rights or personal property. The Great Hall's transformation from dining space to sleeping quarters happened with well-practiced efficiency. As the evening meal concluded and the trestle tables were dismantled, servants would emerge from various corners of the castle carrying the materials needed for the night's rest. The rushes, which had been stored in dry areas during the day, were distributed across the floor in a pattern that had been established through years of trial and error. The areas closest to the fireplace were reserved for those of higher status, while the spaces near the walls and in the corners were left for the lowest-ranking members of the household. The rushes themselves were far more sophisticated than they might appear to modern eyes. These were not simply reeds scattered randomly on the floor, but carefully prepared materials that served multiple functions. The rush mats were woven with skill and precision, creating surfaces that were both durable and relatively comfortable. The loose rushes that filled the spaces between the mats were mixed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, and other aromatic plants that served to mask odors and provide a small measure of psychological comfort through their pleasant scents. The preparation of the rushes was a skilled task that fell to specific servants within the household hierarchy. These individuals, often women with experience in weaving and plant preparation, would spend portions of their day maintaining the castle's bedding materials. They would inspect the rushes for signs of wear, dampness, or pest infestation, replacing sections as needed. The herbs mixed with the rushes were chosen not only for their scent, but for their supposed medicinal properties. Some were believed to repel insects, others to promote restful sleep, and still others to ward off disease. The sleeping arrangements within the Great Hall revealed the complex social dynamics of medieval castle life. While the lord and lady enjoyed their curtained area at the upper end of the hall, their personal attendants slept on the floor nearby, wrapped in blankets but without the luxury of a raised bed. These attendants, often young people from noble families who were learning the manners and customs of court life, occupied a unique position in the castle hierarchy. They were servants, but servants of high status, and their proximity to the lord and lady during the vulnerable hours of sleep reflected their trusted position. The pages and damsels who served the noble family represented the aristocracy of the servant class. These young people, typically between the ages of 12 and 20, came from good families and were in the castle to learn the complex social skills necessary for advancement in medieval society. Their sleeping arrangements reflected their elevated status. They might have feather beds or at least better quality straw mattresses. And they were positioned in the hall in a way that acknowledged their importance while still maintaining the communal nature of the sleeping space. The majority of the castle's inhabitants, however, were the ordinary servants whose labor kept the complex machinery of medieval castle life functioning. These men and women, the kitchen workers, the stable hands, the general laborers, made do with whatever bedding they could gather and whatever space they could claim. Their sleeping arrangements were determined by practicality rather than comfort, and they had developed a remarkable ability to find rest in conditions that would seem impossible to modern people. The sounds of the Great Hall at night created a unique acoustic environment that became as familiar to its inhabitants as their own heartbeats. The constant rustling of rushes as people shifted in their sleep, the whispered conversations between servants who were too tired to care about maintaining the formal silence that governed their daytime interactions, the occasional snore or cough that would echo off the stone walls, all of these sounds became part of the nighttime symphony that provided a strange sort of comfort to those who lived within its walls. The cold was a constant presence that shaped every aspect of the nighttime experience. Even in the warmest months, the stone construction of the castle retained a chill that penetrated deep into the bones of its inhabitants. The great fireplace, which had blazed during the evening meal, would gradually die down to glowing embers. that provided minimal warmth to those fortunate enough to sleep near it. The majority of the hall's inhabitants were left to generate their own heat through shared body warmth and whatever blankets or clothing they possessed. The development of sleeping strategies became a crucial survival skill for castle inhabitants. Servants learned to position themselves strategically, sharing body heat with trusted companions while maintaining enough distance to avoid conflicts over space. They developed techniques for using their clothing most effectively, rolling cloaks into pillows, layering garments for maximum warmth, and positioning themselves to take advantage of any available heat source. The relationship between the noble family and their servants was perhaps most intimate during these nighttime hours. The lord and lady, despite their elevated status and curtained sleeping area, were acutely aware of the presence of their household staff. The safety and security of the castle depended on the loyalty and vigilance of these servants, and the shared vulnerability of sleep created bonds that transcended the formal hierarchies of daytime life. The Great Hall's role as a sleeping space also served important security functions. In an age when castles were frequently under threat from external enemies and internal conspiracies, the communal sleeping arrangement ensured that the lord and lady were surrounded by their most trusted servants throughout the night. The presence of dozens of people in the Great Hall made it virtually impossible for assassins or other threats to approach the noble family undetected. The psychological impact of sleeping in such communal conditions cannot be underestimated. The constant awareness of others, the inability to ever be truly alone, the need to maintain appropriate behavior even during the most private moments. All of these factors shape the medieval personality in ways that are difficult for modern people to understand. The boundaries between public and private, between individual and community, were drawn in fundamentally different ways than they are today. As dawn approached and the first light began to filter through the small windows of the Great Hall, the process of transformation would begin again. The rushes would be gathered and stored, the sleeping spaces would be cleared, and the hall would prepare for another day of its multiple functions. But the memory of the night's shared vulnerability, the intimate knowledge of who snored, who talked in their sleep, who tossed and turned with worry, would linger in the minds of all who had shared that space. The question that emerges from this nightly ritual of communal sleep is not merely how people survived such conditions, but how these shared experiences shaped the very fabric of medieval society and the bonds that held castle communities together. Through times of both peace and war, the answer to how communal sleeping shaped medieval society lies in understanding that these shared nighttime experiences created bonds of intimacy and mutual dependence that went far beyond the formal hierarchies of daytime life. When the lord and lady lay down behind their curtain, separated from their servants by nothing more than a piece of cloth, they were participating in a form of social contract that acknowledged their fundamental humanity and shared vulnerability. The Great Hall's nighttime transformation was more than just a practical solution to the problem of housing. It was a ritual that reinforced the complex web of relationships that held medieval society together. Every person who settled onto those rushes understood their place not just in the castle's hierarchy, but in the broader social order that governed their world. The servant who slept near the fireplace earned that position through years of loyal service, just as the scullion who shivered in the corner understood that his position was the result of his place in the social order. The intimate knowledge that came from sharing sleeping spaces created a unique form of social intelligence. The lord and lady, despite their elevated status, were acutely aware of the moods, concerns, and loyalties of their household staff. They knew who slept peacefully and who was troubled by nightmares, who was sick and who was healthy, who was trustworthy and who might pose a threat. This knowledge, gained through the involuntary intimacy of shared sleep, was crucial for maintaining the delicate balance of power that kept the castle functioning. The servants, for their part, developed an equally sophisticated understanding of their masters. They knew the Lord's sleeping patterns, his private conversations with his wife, his fears and concerns that were revealed in the vulnerable hours of the night. This knowledge was both a form of power and a burden, for it carried with it the responsibility of discretion and the constant awareness that they were privy to secrets that could have far-reaching consequences. The communal sleeping arrangements also served as a form of social education for the young people who lived in the castle. The pages and damsels who shared the great hall learned not just the formal rules of courtly behavior, but the subtle nuances of human interaction that could only be observed in the unguarded moments of sleep. They learned to read the social dynamics of the castle, to understand the relationships between different members of the household, and to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized medieval castle life. The physical challenges of sleeping on the great hall floor had long-term consequences for the health and well-being of castle inhabitants. The constant cold, the hard surfaces, the lack of privacy, and the stress of communal living all took their toll on the human body and spirit. Many servants developed rheumatism and other joint problems from sleeping on cold, hard floors. The lack of restorative sleep, caused by the constant noise and movement of others, led to chronic fatigue and reduced immunity to disease. Yet these same challenging conditions also fostered remarkable resilience and adaptability. The men and women who survived and thrived in castle life developed physical and mental toughness that allowed them to endure hardships that would break modern people. They learned to find rest in the most uncomfortable conditions, to maintain their dignity and humanity in situations that stripped away all pretense and privacy, and to form meaningful relationships despite the constraints of their social positions. The seasonal variations in castle life made the sleeping arrangements even more challenging. During the harsh winter months, when the cold was so intense that water froze in the chambers, the great hall became a refuge of shared warmth that meant the difference between life and death for many inhabitants. The fire that burned in the great fireplace was more than just a source of heat. It was a symbol of life itself, around which the castle community gathered for survival. The summer months brought different challenges. The stone walls that provided blessed coolness during the day retained their chill at night, creating a constant dampness that penetrated clothing and blankets. The increased insect activity during warmer weather made the rush bedding less comfortable, and the longer daylight hours disrupted the natural rhythms of sleep and waking that governed castle life. The great hall's role as a sleeping space came to an end gradually. As castle architecture evolved and social attitudes changed, the development of separate chambers for different members of the household, the increasing availability of glass for windows, and the gradual improvements in heating technology all contributed to the transformation of castle living. The communal sleeping arrangements that had characterized medieval castle life for centuries began to give way to more private accommodations that reflected changing ideas about individual rights and personal space. The transition away from communal sleeping was not simply a matter of improved comfort or technology. It represented a fundamental shift in how people understood the relationship between individual and community. The Great Hall had been a space where the boundaries between self and society were constantly negotiated, where personal identity was shaped by communal experience, and where the aristocratic ideal of service and loyalty was lived out in the most intimate circumstances. The legacy of the Great Hall's sleeping arrangements can be seen in the continuing importance of communal spaces in human society. The modern office, the military barracks, the college dormitory, all of these spaces reflect the human need for both individual identity and communal belonging that was first expressed in the rush-covered floors of medieval castle. Great halls, the impact of these sleeping arrangements on medieval literature, art, and culture was profound. The intimate knowledge of human nature that came from shared sleeping spaces informed the great works of medieval literature. From the Canterbury Tales to the Arthurian romances, The understanding of human relationships, the awareness of social dynamics, and the appreciation for both individual dignity and communal responsibility that characterized medieval culture all had their roots in the shared experiences of the Great Hall floor. As we reflect on the sleeping arrangements of the medieval Great Hall, we are reminded that the human capacity for adaptation, resilience, and community extends far beyond our modern concepts of comfort and privacy. The men and women who lay down on those rushes each night were not merely surviving. They were creating a form of social organization that would influence human society for centuries to come. The Great Hall floor, with its rush mats and communal sleeping arrangements, was not simply a place where people rested. It was a laboratory of human relationships, a school of social understanding, and a testament to the enduring power of shared experience to shape individual character and collective identity. In the end, the shocking reality of sleeping on a castle floor was not the physical discomfort, but the profound intimacy of a society that understood that true security came not from walls and weapons, but from the bonds of trust and mutual dependence that were forged in the vulnerable hours of shared sleep. In the darkest corners of Goodrich Castle, where the stone walls wept with perpetual dampness and the air hung thick with the scent of mold and accumulated grime, lived the forgotten army that made castle life possible. These were not the servants, who slept in the Great Hall, close to the warmth of the dying fire and the relative security of their lord's presence. These were the invisible workers who inhabited the castle's most neglected spaces, the cellars, the attics, the cramped quarters above the kitchens, and the makeshift sleeping areas carved out of storage rooms and abandoned chambers. Richard the Sorcerer, who spent his days in the sweltering kitchen creating the complex sauces that made preserved meat palatable, would climb narrow stone steps each night to reach his sleeping space in the castle's upper levels. The room he shared with 3 other kitchen workers was barely large enough for their bodies, with a ceiling so low that a man of average height could not stand upright. The walls were rough stone, never finished with plaster or lime wash, and the single small window was nothing more than a hole in the wall, covered with a piece of oiled cloth that provided minimal protection from the elements. The sleeping arrangements in these forgotten spaces were determined by the harsh realities of castle architecture and the rigid hierarchies that governed servant life. The cellars, built deep into the earth for food storage and protection during sieges, had been partially converted into sleeping quarters for the lowest-ranking servants. These underground chambers, while providing protection from the wind and some degree of warmth from the Earth's natural insulation, were plagued by problems that made them barely habitable. The cellar walls constantly seeped moisture, creating an environment where mold and fungus thrived. The air was thick and stagnant, with little circulation to carry away the accumulated odors of human habitation. The floors were crude stone or packed earth, often covered with a thin layer of straw that quickly became sodden and began to rot. The servants who slept in these spaces learned to live with the constant dampness that penetrated their clothing and blankets, making truly dry sleep an impossibility. The attic spaces presented different but equally challenging conditions. These areas, tucked under the castle's steep roofs, were accessible only through narrow staircases or, in some cases, ladders that had to be climbed in complete darkness. The roof timbers, massive oak beams that had been hewn from ancient forests, created a maze of obstacles that servants had to navigate carefully to avoid injury. The spaces between the beams were filled with whatever materials had been used for insulation: straw, moss, animal hair, or simply the accumulated debris of years of habitation. The temperature in the attics varied dramatically with the seasons. In summer, the heat from the sun beating down on the roof made these spaces nearly unbearable, with temperatures that could reach levels that made sleep impossible. In winter, the cold penetrated through every crack and crevice, turning the attics into ice chambers where breath formed clouds and water froze in any container left overnight. The servants who slept in these spaces developed strategies for survival that tested the limits of human endurance. The quarters above the kitchens, while technically more comfortable due to the heat that rose from the cooking fires below, presented their own unique challenges. The air was thick with smoke, grease, and the accumulated odors of food preparation. The floors, made of rough planks, were slippery with condensation and the grease that permeated everything in the kitchen area. The constant noise from the kitchens below, the clatter of pots, the shouting of orders, the crash of dropped implements made restful sleep nearly impossible. The hierarchy among the servants was reflected in their sleeping arrangements with ruthless precision. The cook, as a skilled professional whose services were essential to the castle's functioning, might have a small private chamber near the kitchen. The undercooks and more skilled kitchen workers shared slightly better quarters, while the scullions and general laborers were relegated to the worst spaces, the dampest corners of the cellars, the most cramped attic spaces, or the areas closest to the castle's defensive walls where the cold was most intense. The servants who worked in the stables faced their own unique sleeping challenges. Many of them actually slept in the stables themselves, in small lofts above the horse stalls, where they could be available at any hour to care for the animals. The warmth generated by the horses provided some comfort, but the constant noise of the animals, the thick atmosphere filled with dust and animal odors, and the ever-present risk of fire from the straw bedding made these accommodations both uncomfortable and dangerous. The laundresses, who worked in the castle's washing areas, often slept in chambers that were perpetually damp from the steam and moisture of their work. These women, who spent their days scrubbing clothes and linens in cold water with harsh soap made from animal fat and ash, would retire to sleeping spaces that were little more than extensions of their workplace. The constant dampness made it impossible to ever be truly dry, and many of these women suffered from respiratory ailments and joint problems that were the direct result of their living conditions. The castle's defensive requirements also shaped the sleeping arrangements of many servants. The men-at-arms and other military personnel were housed in barracks-like spaces within the castle walls, designed more for security and quick mobilization than for comfort. These chambers, typically located near the castle's main gates or defensive points, were Spartan in the extreme stone walls, narrow windows that were really arrow slits, and sleeping spaces that were little more than platforms built into the walls. The servants who worked in the castle's various workshops, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the rope maker, often slept in spaces attached to their work areas. These arrangements, while providing some privacy and the security of being near their tools and materials, also meant that they were never truly free from the demands of their trades. The blacksmith might sleep in a small chamber adjacent to his forge where the residual heat provided warmth, but where the air was thick with the smoke and fumes of his work. The personal servants of the lord and lady, the chambermaids, the body servants, the wardrobe keepers occupied a unique position in the castle hierarchy. Their sleeping arrangements reflected their elevated status within the servant class. But they also faced unique challenges related to their intimate proximity to their masters. These servants often slept in small chambers near the lord and lady's private quarters, where they could be summoned at any hour to attend to their masters. The psychological impact of sleeping in these forgotten spaces cannot be underestimated. The servants who inhabited these areas lived in a world of constant insecurity, where their sleeping space could be reassigned at any moment, where privacy was non-existent, and where the physical conditions of their accommodation reflected their low status in the castle hierarchy. The knowledge that their sleeping arrangements were determined entirely by the whims of their superiors and the practical needs of the castle created a constant state of anxiety and uncertainty. The seasonal variations in these sleeping spaces were extreme. During the winter months, the servants in the cellars might find their sleeping areas partially flooded as groundwater seeped through the stone walls. Those in the attics faced the constant threat of snow and ice penetrating through gaps in the roof. while the servants near the kitchens had to cope with the additional humidity created by the increased cooking required to warm the castle and feed its inhabitants during the long, cold months. The summer months brought different challenges. The cellars, while cooler, became breeding grounds for insects and vermin that thrived in the damp, warm conditions. The attics became furnaces that made sleep virtually impossible during the hottest parts of the day. The servants who worked and slept near the kitchens faced the additional challenge of increased food preparation during the summer months, when the castle's population might swell with visitors and the preservation of food for winter storage required constant attention. The makeshift nature of many of these sleeping arrangements meant that servants had to be constantly adaptable, ready to relocate at a moment's notice if their space was needed for other purposes. A storage room might be converted into sleeping quarters during times of high population, only to be reclaimed for its original purpose when the need arose. This constant uncertainty about their most basic need, a place to sleep, created a psychological stress that affected every aspect of their lives. As you contemplate the harsh realities of these forgotten spaces, a troubling question emerges. How did human beings maintain their dignity, their hope, and their humanity while living in conditions that seem designed to strip away every vestige of personal worth and individual identity? The answer to how servants maintained their humanity in such dehumanizing conditions lies in understanding the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the complex social networks that developed even in the most challenging circumstances. The servants who inhabited the castle's forgotten spaces did not simply endure their conditions. They actively created communities, hierarchies, and support systems that provided meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging even in the most hostile environments. Within the cramped quarters above the kitchens, Richard the Sorcerer and his 3 companions developed a sophisticated system of mutual support that went far beyond the mere sharing of physical space. Each man had his designated sleeping area, marked not by physical boundaries, but by unspoken agreements that had evolved over months of shared habitation. The man who slept closest to the single window held the responsibility for opening and closing the oiled cloth covering, adjusting the ventilation according to the weather and the needs of the group. The servant who occupied the space nearest to the door became the unofficial guardian of their shared space, responsible for ensuring that their few possessions remained secure and that unauthorized visitors were kept out. The development of these micro-communities within the castle's servant population was essential for survival. In the cellars, where the dampness and cold created conditions that could quickly become life-threatening, the servants learned to share body heat, taking turns sleeping in the center of their group where the warmth was greatest. They developed systems for rotating their limited bedding materials, ensuring that everyone had access to the driest straw or the least moldy blankets. The knowledge of who was sick, who was struggling, and who needed additional support became part of the collective intelligence that kept the group functioning. The servants' intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden spaces gave them a unique form of power within the broader castle hierarchy. They knew which walls were weakest, which passages were most secure, and which areas could be used for storage or hiding. This knowledge became a form of currency that could be traded for better sleeping arrangements, additional food rations, or protection from the harsher aspects of servant life. The servant who knew how to navigate the castle's complex layout in complete darkness, who understood the sounds that indicated potential danger, or who could identify the subtle signs of structural problems, became valuable to both their fellow servants and their masters. The creation of informal hierarchies within the servant population provided structure and stability in otherwise chaotic conditions. In the attic spaces, where the physical challenges of the environment were extreme, the servants developed leadership structures based on experience, skill, and the ability to help others survive. The servant who had lived in the attics the longest became the unofficial leader, responsible for teaching newcomers how to navigate the treacherous beams, how to find the best sleeping spots, and how to avoid the areas where the roof leaked most severely. These servant leaders also took on the responsibility of maintaining morale and providing psychological support to their fellow workers. They became storytellers, sharing tales that helped pass the long, uncomfortable nights. They organized the sharing of food and resources, ensuring that the weakest members of the group received the support they needed to survive. They mediated disputes and conflicts, preventing the tensions that naturally arose from overcrowded, stressful conditions from destroying the fragile communities that made survival possible. The servants' relationship with their work provided another source of meaning and identity that transcended their harsh living conditions. Richard the Sorcerer, despite sleeping in a cramped, airless room, took pride in his culinary skills and the recognition they brought him within the castle hierarchy. The knowledge that his sauces were praised by the lord and lady, that his work was essential to the castle's functioning, and that his skills were valued by his peers provided a sense of purpose that helped him endure the physical hardships of his living situation. The seasonal rhythms of castle life also provided structure and meaning to the servant's existence. The preparation for winter, the laying in of supplies, the adjustment of sleeping arrangements to provide maximum warmth, the reorganization of work schedules to account for shorter days created a sense of shared purpose that unified the servant. Community. The arrival of spring brought new challenges but also new opportunities, as the castle's population might grow with the arrival of visitors, creating possibilities for advancement or at least variation in the monotonous routine of servant life. The servant's religious life provided another crucial source of comfort and meaning. Despite their harsh living conditions, they participated in the castle's religious observances, attending services in the castle chapel or gathering in their sleeping areas for informal prayer and worship. The Christian concept of suffering as a path to spiritual growth provided a framework for understanding their hardships that went beyond mere endurance. The belief that their patient acceptance of difficult conditions would be rewarded in the afterlife gave meaning to their daily struggles. The development of romantic relationships within the servant community provided emotional support and companionship that helped individuals cope with the isolation and hardship of their conditions. These relationships, formed in the most challenging circumstances, often displayed remarkable depth and loyalty. The shared experience of hardship created bonds that transcended the temporary nature of castle employment, and many servants found in their relationships with fellow workers the emotional sustenance that enabled them to continue functioning in their demanding roles. The servants' knowledge of the castle's secrets, the private conversations they overheard, the personal habits of their masters, the political intrigues that shaped castle life gave them a sense of importance and connection to the broader world beyond their immediate circumstances. This privileged information, while dangerous to possess, also provided a form of entertainment and intellectual stimulation that helped offset the monotony of their daily routines. The physical adaptations that servants developed in response to their challenging living conditions were remarkable examples of human resilience. Those who slept in the dampest cellars learned to position their bodies to minimize contact with wet surfaces, developed breathing techniques that helped them cope with the thick, stagnant air, and acquired an almost supernatural ability to detect changes in moisture levels that might indicate flooding or other dangers. The servants in the attics developed exceptional balance and spatial awareness, learning to navigate the treacherous roof spaces in complete darkness. The servants' relationship with food, both as workers in the castle's food production system and as consumers of whatever rations were available to them, provided another source of meaning and community. The sharing of food, the communal preparation of meals in their cramped quarters, and the exchange of culinary knowledge created bonds that transcended the formal hierarchies of castle life. The servant who could improve the taste of the coarse bread and thin soup that formed the bulk of their diet became a valued member of the community. The development of escape fantasies and dreams of advancement provides psychological relief from the harshness of daily life. Servants would share stories of others who had risen from humble beginnings to positions of importance, creating a mythology of possibility that helps sustain hope even in the darkest circumstances. The knowledge that their service, if performed with exceptional skill and loyalty, might eventually lead to better conditions or even freedom, provided motivation that went beyond mere survival. The servant's ability to find moments of beauty and joy even in their harsh circumstances was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their psychological survival. A shaft of sunlight penetrating the gloom of a cellar chamber, the sound of music drifting from the great hall, the taste of a special meal prepared for a feast. These small pleasures took on enormous significance for people whose daily lives offered little comfort or beauty. The question that emerges from this examination of servant life is not simply how they survived, but how their experiences in these forgotten spaces shaped their understanding of human relationships, community, and the meaning of dignity in the face of adversity. What lessons did they learn about the nature of power, the importance of mutual support, and the resilience of the human spirit that would influence their behavior for the rest of their lives? The lessons learned in the castle's forgotten spaces created a unique form of wisdom that shaped not only individual character, but also the broader social understanding of medieval society. The servants who emerged from these harsh conditions carried with them insights about human nature, social organization, and the meaning of true nobility that often surpassed the understanding of their social superiors who had never experienced. Such challenges the concept of dignity, as understood by the servants who slept in cellars and attics, was fundamentally different from the dignity claimed by the nobles who inhabited the castle's finest chambers. For the servants, dignity was not conferred by birth or position, but earned through daily acts of courage, kindness, and mutual support. The servant who shared his last piece of bread with a sick companion, who helped a newcomer find his way in the treacherous attic spaces, or who maintained his integrity despite the degrading conditions of his life, had achieved a form of nobility that transcended the artificial hierarchies of medieval society. This understanding of earned dignity created a parallel value system within the servant community that often contradicted the official hierarchies of castle life. The servant who held the highest position in the castle's formal structure might be despised by his peers if he failed to show compassion for those beneath him, while a lowly scullion who demonstrated exceptional character might be held in high esteem by the entire servant community. These alternative hierarchies, based on character rather than position, provided a form of social justice that helped maintain morale and prevent the complete demoralization that might otherwise have resulted from the harsh conditions of servant life. The servants' understanding of leadership, developed through their experiences in the forgotten spaces, emphasized service rather than authority. The informal leaders who emerged in the cellars and attics were those who took responsibility for the welfare of others, who shared their knowledge and resources, and who were willing to sacrifice their own comfort for the good of the group. This servant leadership model, born from necessity in the harsh conditions of castle life, would eventually influence broader social and political concepts about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The psychological resilience developed by the servants in these challenging conditions had profound implications for their ability to cope with other aspects of medieval life. The servant who had learned to find rest in a damp, cold cellar was better equipped to handle the physical demands of his work, the emotional stress of serving demanding masters, and the uncertainty that characterized life in an age of constant warfare and social upheaval. The skills developed in the forgotten spaces, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, and to maintain hope in the face of adversity, became valuable assets that could be applied to every aspect of their lives. The servants' intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden spaces and secret passages gave them a unique perspective on power and security that was often more accurate than the understanding of their masters. They knew which walls were crumbling, which foundations were weak, and which defensive positions were most vulnerable. This knowledge made them valuable advisors during times of conflict. But it also gave them a clear understanding of the temporary nature of power and the vulnerability of even the most seemingly secure positions. The seasonal adaptations that servants developed in response to their challenging living conditions created a deep understanding of natural rhythms and cycles that connected them to the broader patterns of medieval life. The servant who had learned to anticipate the flooding of cellar chambers based on subtle changes in the weather was also better equipped to understand the agricultural cycles that determined food availability, the military campaigning seasons that affected castle security, and the economic patterns that influenced their employment prospects. The community building skills developed in the forgotten spaces had applications far beyond the castle walls. The servants who learned to create functional communities in the most challenging circumstances carried these skills with them when they moved to new positions, when they established their own households, or when they participated in the broader social institutions of medieval society. The ability to build trust, to organize mutual support systems, and to maintain morale in difficult circumstances became valuable assets that influenced everything from guild organization to village governance. The servants' relationship with material possessions, shaped by their experience of living with virtually nothing, created a practical understanding of value and priority that often surpassed the wisdom of their wealthier contemporaries. The servant who had learned to extract maximum utility from a threadbare blanket, who could turn scraps of food into nourishing meals, a coal, and who could find comfort in the smallest pleasures, had developed a form of practical wisdom that enabled them to find satisfaction and meaning regardless of their material circumstances. The intimate knowledge of human nature that came from sharing cramped, stressful living spaces gave the servants insights into character, motivation, and behavior that were invaluable in their interactions with others. The servant who had learned to read the subtle signs of illness, exhaustion, or emotional distress in his sleeping companions was better equipped to understand the needs and motivations of his masters, his fellow workers, and the broader community in which he lived. The religious and spiritual insights developed in the forgotten spaces often demonstrated a depth of understanding that surpassed the formal religious education of their social superiors. The servant who had experienced genuine suffering and had learned to find meaning in hardship often developed a more authentic relationship with the spiritual aspects of medieval Christianity than those who had never faced serious challenges. The prayers whispered in cold, dark cellars, the mutual support provided in times of crisis, and the gratitude expressed for the smallest mercies created a lived theology that was both practical and profound. The servants' understanding of justice, developed through their experiences of inequality and hardship, created a moral framework that emphasized fairness, compassion, and the fundamental worth of all human beings. This understanding often put them at odds with the formal, legal, and social systems of medieval society, but it also provided a foundation for social criticism and reform that would eventually influence broader changes in medieval culture. The legacy of the servants who lived in the castle's forgotten spaces extended far beyond their individual lives. Their children, who grew up hearing stories of their parents' experiences, developed an understanding of hardship and resilience that shaped their own approach to life's challenges. The communities they formed, the values they developed, and the wisdom they gained became part of the cultural inheritance of medieval society, influencing everything from folk tales and popular culture to the development of social and political institutions. The economic understanding developed by servants who had lived with scarcity and uncertainty provided insights into resource management, planning, and survival that were often more practical than the theoretical knowledge of their educated superiors. The servant who had learned to stretch meager resources through careful planning and creative use was better equipped to understand the economic challenges facing the castle, the region, and the broader society. The servants' experience of living in the forgotten spaces also provided them with a unique perspective on the relationship between environment and human behavior. They understood how physical conditions influenced mood, health, and social interaction in ways that were often invisible to those who lived in more comfortable circumstances. This understanding made them valuable advisors on matters ranging from the design of workspaces to the management of large groups of people. The courage required to maintain dignity and hope in the face of such challenging conditions created a form of moral strength that influenced every aspect of the servants' lives. The servant who had learned to find meaning in suffering, to maintain integrity in degrading circumstances, and to show compassion despite experiencing hardship had developed character traits that enabled them to face any challenge with confidence and grace. The story of the servants who slept in the castle's forgotten spaces is ultimately a story about the indomitable nature of the human spirit and the remarkable ability of people to create meaning, community, and dignity even in the most challenging circumstances. Their experiences remind us that true nobility lies not in the circumstances of our lives, but in how we respond to those circumstances, and that the most profound lessons about human nature often come from those who have faced the greatest challenges. With courage, compassion, and hope. In the end, the forgotten spaces of the medieval castle were not merely places where servants slept. They were laboratories of human character, schools of practical wisdom, and sanctuaries of the human spirit that produced individuals of remarkable resilience, insight, and moral strength whose influence extended far beyond the stone walls that contained their bodies but could never confine their souls. The first frost of autumn at Goodrich Castle arrived with deceptive beauty, transforming the morning rushes in the great hall into a carpet of crystalline splendor that crunched underfoot as the servants began their daily routines. But for those who understood the rhythms of medieval castle life, this delicate display of ice was not a harbinger of winter wonder, but a warning of the brutal months ahead. The transformation of the castle from a merely uncomfortable dwelling place into a fortress of cold stone that would test the limits of human endurance was about to begin. The seasonal preparation for winter in a medieval castle was a complex orchestration of survival strategies that had been refined over centuries of harsh experience. As the autumn days grew shorter and the first bitter winds began to howl through the arrow slits and unglazed windows, every aspect of castle life had to be reorganized around the single, overwhelming imperative of staying warm enough to survive until spring. The servants who had spent the summer months sleeping in the castle's forgotten spaces would soon discover that their challenging living conditions were about to become matters of life and death. The castle's architecture, which had been designed primarily for defense rather than comfort, presented unique challenges during the winter months. The massive stone walls, while providing excellent protection against arrows and siege engines, also acted as enormous heat sinks that absorbed what little warmth could be generated and then radiated it away into the cold night air. The stone floors, already uncomfortable during the warmer months, became sheets of ice that could cause serious injury to anyone who lost their footing in the darkness. The Great Hall, which had served as the communal sleeping area for much of the castle's population, underwent a dramatic transformation as winter approached. The single great fireplace, which had been adequate for heating during the milder months, became the focal point of an elaborate system of heat conservation that would determine who lived and who died during the darkest months of the year. The positioning of sleeping areas around the fireplace became a matter of crucial importance, with the spots closest to the flames reserved for the most valuable members of the household. The rushes that had covered the floors during the summer months had to be completely replaced as winter approached. The old rushes, which had absorbed months of moisture, spilled food, and human waste, had become breeding grounds for insects and disease that would be even more dangerous in the confined conditions of winter. The new rushes, carefully dried and mixed with aromatic herbs, were laid in thick layers that would provide insulation from the stone floors and help trap what little heat could be generated. The servants who slept in the castle's cellars faced particularly acute challenges. As winter approached, the underground chambers, which had provided some relief from the summer heat, now became ice caves where the moisture that constantly seeped through the stone walls froze into sheets of ice that made movement treacherous. The air in these spaces became so cold that breathing produced clouds of vapor that quickly turned to ice on any surface they touched. The servants who inhabited these spaces had to develop new strategies for survival that went far beyond the simple sharing of warmth and resources that had sustained them during the milder months. The attic spaces, which had been furnaces during the summer, now became wind tunnels where the cold air swept through every crack and crevice with a ferocity that made normal sleep impossible. The servants who lived in these spaces had to learn to construct elaborate barriers using whatever materials they could find: scraps of cloth, bundles of straw, even their own clothing, to create small pockets of relatively warm air where they could huddle together for survival. The kitchen areas, which had been uncomfortably hot during the summer, now became the most desirable sleeping locations in the entire castle. The residual heat from the cooking fires, the protection from the wind provided by the thick walls, and the proximity to the food stores made these spaces precious real estate that was allocated according to the strict hierarchies of castle life. The servants who worked in the kitchens found themselves in the unusual position of being envied by their peers for their access to warmth and food. The transformation of the castle's daily routines to accommodate winter conditions was dramatic and comprehensive. The servants who had begun their work at dawn during the summer months now had to begin their tasks in complete darkness, fumbling through ice-covered passages with only the faint light of rushes or candles to guide them. The simple act of drawing water from the castle's wells became a dangerous undertaking, as the buckets would freeze solid if left exposed to the air for more than a few minutes. The castle's food storage systems, which had been designed to provide for the population during siege conditions, now faced the additional challenge of preventing the stored supplies from freezing solid. The servants responsible for maintaining the food stores had to develop elaborate systems of insulation and protection that would keep the grain from freezing, the preserved meats from becoming inedible, and the ale from turning to ice. The failure of these systems would mean starvation for the entire castle population. The social dynamics of castle life were also dramatically altered by the winter conditions. The lord and lady, who had enjoyed the relative luxury of their private chambers during the warmer months, now found themselves dependent on their servants in ways that blurred the traditional boundaries of the feudal hierarchy. The servant who knew how to maintain a fire through the night, who could find dry fuel in the depths of winter, or who could prepare warming foods from the limited ingredients available, became invaluable to the survival of the entire household. The psychological impact of the winter months on the castle's inhabitants was profound and lasting. The constant cold, the shortened daylight hours, the isolation from the outside world, and the ever-present threat of death from exposure or starvation created a form of psychological stress that affected every aspect of life within the castle walls. The servants who had managed to maintain their dignity and hope during the challenging but manageable conditions of summer now faced a test of their mental and emotional resilience that would determine whether they would see another spring. The castle's defensive capabilities were also severely compromised by the winter conditions. The guards who had to maintain their posts on the castle walls faced the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia. That made effective defense increasingly difficult as the winter progressed. The weapons and equipment that had been maintained in fighting condition during the warmer months required constant attention to prevent them from freezing solid or becoming too brittle to use effectively. The religious life of the castle took on new significance during the winter months. The chapel, which had been a place of routine worship during the summer, now became a crucial source of psychological comfort and community support. The servants who gathered for prayers and services found in their shared religious observances a source of hope and meaning that helped them endure the longevious. The relationships between the servants, which had been complex but manageable during the milder months, now became matters of survival. The willingness to share warmth, food, and resources became the difference between life and death, while selfishness or cruelty could result in the destruction of the small communities that made survival possible. The informal hierarchies that had developed during the summer months were tested and often transformed by the extreme conditions of winter. The medical challenges faced by the castle's inhabitants during the winter months were severe and often fatal. The cold, damp conditions were perfect breeding grounds for respiratory diseases, while the lack of fresh food led to nutritional deficiencies that weakened the immune system. The servants who had managed to maintain their health during the summer months now faced a constant battle against illness that would claim many lives before the winter was over. The very concept of comfort had to be redefined in the context of winter castle life. The servant who had complained about the hardness of the stone floors during the summer now considered himself fortunate if he could find a space that was merely cold rather than freezing. The relative luxury of sleeping near the great fireplace, which had been taken for granted during the milder months, now became a privilege that was fought over with desperate intensity as the first blizzard of winter began to howl around the castle walls, covering the narrow windows with snow and ice. The true test of human endurance was about to begin. The question that haunted every inhabitant of the castle was not merely how they would survive the winter, but whether the social bonds and community structures that had sustained them through the milder months would be strong enough to withstand the ultimate test of cold, hunger, and desperation that lay ahead. The answer to whether the social bonds of castle life could withstand the extreme pressures of winter became apparent within the first month of serious cold. As the temperature plummeted and the snow began to accumulate against the castle walls, the carefully constructed hierarchies and community structures that had governed servant life during the milder months underwent a dramatic transformation that revealed both the best and worst of human nature in the Great Hall. The area around the massive fireplace became a carefully negotiated territory, where the physics of heat distribution intersected with the complex social dynamics of medieval life. The lord and lady, despite their elevated status, found themselves sharing warmth with their personal servants in ways that would have been unthinkable during the summer months. The curtain that had provided symbolic privacy during the warmer months now became a wind barrier that was adjusted and repositioned throughout the night by servants who had gained intimate knowledge of air currents and heat flow. The servants who slept closest to the fire developed a sophisticated system of rotation that ensured everyone in the Great Hall had access to some warmth during the coldest hours of the night. The servants who had earned the privileged positions nearest the flames were expected to share their warmth with others, creating a continuous circulation of bodies that maximized heat distribution while maintaining the social distinctions that govern daily life. This system required a level of cooperation and mutual trust that transcended the formal hierarchies of castle life. The cellars, which had been challenging living spaces during the summer, now became death traps where the servants had to employ extreme measures to survive. The moisture that had merely made these spaces uncomfortable during the milder months now froze into ice sheets that covered the walls and floors, creating an environment where the air itself seemed to burn the lungs. With each breath, the servants who inhabited these spaces learned to build elaborate shelters within the cellars, using whatever materials they could find to create small, enclosed spaces where shared body heat could be trapped and preserved. The development of these survival shelters required skills that went far beyond the simple sharing of resources that had characterized summer life. The servants had to become engineers, designing structures that would provide maximum insulation with minimum materials. They had to become meteorologists, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when the temperature was about to drop, to levels that would require additional protective measures. They had to become doctors, understanding the symptoms of hypothermia and frostbite that could quickly prove fatal if not recognized and treated. The kitchen areas, which had always been warm due to the cooking fires, now became the most valuable real estate in the entire castle. The servants who worked in these spaces found themselves in the unusual position of being courted by their peers for access to warmth and food. The informal alliances that formed around access to the kitchen became crucial survival networks that often crossed the traditional boundaries of castle hierarchy. The scullion who had been at the bottom of the servant hierarchy during the summer might find himself in a position of relative power if he could provide access to the warm kitchen spaces. The redistribution of sleeping arrangements during the winter months created new forms of intimacy and cooperation that challenged the traditional social boundaries of medieval life. Servants who had maintained formal relationships during the summer months now found themselves sharing blankets, body heat, and the most intimate details of their lives as they struggled to survive the brutal conditions. The physical closeness required for survival created emotional bonds that often persisted long after the winter had ended. The castle's food distribution system, which had been adequate during the summer months, now faced the challenge of providing enough nutrition to sustain people who were burning enormous amounts of energy simply to stay warm. The servants who were responsible for managing the food stores had to develop new strategies for preparing meals that would provide Only Ruby Kiss will lonely Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides, unspoused, worth lows. We're response/law all-lasting cower. We're responsible for me, laws last. We live last. We lies. We lie, we lie, we live, we lie. Del lie cowley. We lie spally. We lie mide. By we lie, but by it. With lie kai to me make it's lie sit kki it's I muli I bad si lie I sick it's a slice as I kit is litigada it's less slick to pick it's it is I'll we to meet it's maximum warmth and nutrition while conserving the limited supplies that had to last until spring. The development of these survival cooking techniques required creativity and resourcefulness that went far beyond normal culinary skills. The psychological challenges of winter castle life were as severe as the physical hardships, the constant cold, the shortened daylight hours, and the isolation from the outside world created conditions that modern psychologists would recognize as severe depression and anxiety. The servants who had maintained their mental health during the summer months now faced a form of psychological torture that tested the limits of human endurance. The ability to maintain hope and sanity in such conditions required mental strength that few people possess. The religious life of the castle took on new dimensions during the winter months as the inhabitants sought comfort and meaning in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The chapel, which had been a place of routine worship during the summer, now became a refuge where the castle's inhabitants could find warmth, community, and spiritual comfort. The prayers and services that had been formal obligations during the milder months now became desperate appeals for survival and deliverance from the brutal conditions. The relationships between masters and servants underwent fundamental changes during the winter months as the traditional hierarchies of castle life proved inadequate to deal with the extreme conditions. The lord and lady, who had maintained their elevated status through the summer months, now found themselves dependent on their servants for survival in ways that blurred the traditional boundaries of feudal society. The servant who could maintain a fire through the night, who knew how to find dry fuel in the depths of winter, or who could prepare warming foods from limited ingredients became more valuable than the highest-ranking nobles. The medical challenges of winter castle life were severe, and often fatal. The cold, damp conditions created perfect breeding grounds for respiratory diseases that could spread rapidly through the confined spaces of the castle. The lack of fresh food led to nutritional deficiencies that weakened the immune system and made the inhabitants more susceptible to illness. The servants who had the knowledge and skills to treat these conditions became crucial members of the castle community, often elevated to positions of influence that would have been impossible during the summer months. The water supply systems of the castle faced unique challenges during the winter months that threatened the survival of the entire population. The wells that had provided adequate water during the summer months now froze solid, requiring the servants to develop new techniques for obtaining and storing water. The simple act of drawing water from a well became a dangerous undertaking that required careful planning and coordination. The servants who had the knowledge and skills to maintain the water supply became essential members of the survival community. The servant who could maintain a fire through the night, who knew how to prepare warming foods from limited ingredients, or who could provide medical care during illness had achieved a form of practical nobility that commanded respect regardless of their formal social position. The development of the rotation system around the grate fireplace had evolved into a sophisticated form of social organization that balanced the needs of survival with the requirements of maintaining social order. The servants who had earned positions closest to the fire were expected to share their warmth with others, but they also gained the responsibility of maintaining the fire and ensuring that the heat distribution system continued to function effectively. This responsibility came with a form of authority that was based on practical necessity rather than inherited privilege. The psychological transformation of the castle's inhabitants during the depths of winter was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their survival experience. The servants who had begun the winter as individuals struggling to maintain their personal dignity and identity had become part of a collective organism focused entirely on survival. The boundaries between self and community had become fluid, with individual needs subordinated to the requirements of group survival. This transformation required a fundamental shift in consciousness that challenged the medieval understanding of individual identity and social responsibility. The servants who had survived the winter in the castle's cellars had achieved something approaching legendary status within the castle community. Their ability to create livable spaces in conditions that seemed impossible to survive had required not only physical courage, but also ingenuity and resourcefulness that commanded respect from all levels of castle society. The techniques they had developed for insulation, heat conservation, and group survival had become valuable knowledge that was shared throughout the castle community. The kitchen areas, which had become the most valuable real estate in the castle, had also become centers of innovation and creativity that transformed the entire approach to winter survival. The servants who worked in these spaces had developed new cooking techniques that maximized nutrition and warmth while conserving fuel and ingredients. These innovations had implications that extended far beyond the immediate needs of winter survival, influencing cooking practices and food preparation, techniques that would be passed down through generations. The religious life of the castle had undergone a profound transformation during the winter months that reflected the spiritual dimensions of the survival experience. The chapel services, which had been formal obligations during the summer months, had become genuine expressions of faith, hope, and community solidarity. The prayers and hymns that had been routine recitations during the milder months now carried emotional weight and spiritual significance that reflected the depth of the survival experience. The relationships between masters and servants that had developed during the winter months had created new forms of mutual understanding and respect that challenged the traditional assumptions of feudal society. The lord and lady had gained first-hand experience of the skills, knowledge, and character of their servants in ways that would have been impossible during normal conditions. The servants, for their part, had seen their masters struggling with the same challenges and limitations that affected everyone in the castle, creating a shared understanding of human vulnerability that transcended social distinctions. The medical knowledge and skills that had been developed during the winter months had created a new appreciation for the value of practical knowledge and empirical observation. The servants who had learned to recognize and treat the symptoms of hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related illnesses had gained expertise. That was more valuable than the theoretical knowledge possessed by many of their educated superiors. This practical medical knowledge would be preserved and transmitted through the servant community, contributing to the development of folk medicine traditions that would influence healing practices for new generations. The water management systems that had been developed during the winter months had required engineering skills and practical knowledge that challenged the traditional assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of the servant class. The servants who had learned to prevent wells from freezing, to store water in frozen conditions, and to distribute water efficiently throughout the castle had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that earned them respect and recognition from all levels of castle society. The fuel management systems that had been essential for winter survival had created new forms of expertise and authority within the servant community. The servants who had learned to find, store, and distribute fuel efficiently had gained knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death for the entire castle population. This expertise had created new forms of social capital that could be used to improve their position within the castle hierarchy. The waste management challenges of Winter Castle. Life had required the development of new techniques and approaches that reflected the practical ingenuity of the servant community. The servants who had learned to deal with frozen waste disposal systems to maintain sanitary conditions in extreme cold and to prevent disease outbreaks had gained expertise that was essential for the health and survival of the entire castle. Population, the social innovations that had emerged during the winter months had created new forms of organization and cooperation that challenged the traditional hierarchies of medieval society. The survival committees that had formed around specific challenges, heat distribution, food preparation, medical care, fuel management had created new forms of leadership and authority that were based on practical skills and knowledge rather than inherited privilege. The psychological resilience that had been developed during the winter months had created new forms of mental strength and emotional stability that would influence the behavior and attitudes of the castle's inhabitants for years to come. The servants who had learned to maintain hope and sanity in seemingly impossible conditions had gained psychological resources that would serve them well in facing the other challenges of medieval life. The economic understanding that had developed during the winter months had created new appreciation for the value of careful planning, resource conservation, and efficient distribution. The servants who had learned to manage scarce resources effectively had gained knowledge that would be valuable in all aspects of castle life, from managing household budgets to planning for future emergencies. The legacy of the winter survival experience extended far beyond the immediate challenges of staying alive during the cold months. The social bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared hardship, the practical knowledge that had been developed through necessity, and the psychological resilience that had been gained through extreme challenge had created a form of human capital that would influence the development of medieval society for generations to come. The servants who had survived the winter in the stone fortress had proven that human beings could adapt to seemingly impossible conditions through cooperation, creativity, and mutual support. They had demonstrated that true nobility lay not in inherited privilege, but in the courage to face adversity, the wisdom to find solutions to complex problems, and the compassion to care for others in times of need. Their experience had created new forms of social understanding that would eventually challenge the fundamental assumptions of feudal society and contribute to the gradual transformation of medieval civilization. In the end, the seasonal struggle of winter nights in stone fortresses had revealed both the harsh realities of medieval life and the remarkable capacity of human beings to transcend their circumstances through community, creativity, and courage. The servants who had slept on frozen floors, who had shared their warmth and resources with others, and who had maintained their dignity and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, had created a legacy of human resilience that would inspire future generations to face their own challenges with similar courage and determination. The medical knowledge and skills that had been developed during the winter months had created a new appreciation for the value of practical knowledge and empirical observation. The servants who had learned to recognize and treat the symptoms of hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related illnesses had gained expertise that was more valuable than the theoretical knowledge possessed by many of their educated superiors. This practical medical knowledge would be preserved and transmitted through the servant community, contributing to the development of folk medicine traditions that would influence healing practices for new generations. The water management systems that had been developed during the winter months had required engineering skills and practical knowledge that challenged the traditional assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of the servant class. The servants who had learned to prevent wells from freezing, to store water in frozen conditions, and to distribute water efficiently throughout the castle had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that earned them respect and recognition from all levels of castle society. The fuel management systems that had been essential for winter survival had created new forms of expertise and authority within the servant community. The servants who had learned to find, store, and distribute fuel efficiently had gained knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death for the entire castle population. This expertise had created new forms of social capital that could be used to improve their position within the castle hierarchy. The waste management challenges of Winter Castle. Life had required the development of new techniques and approaches that reflected the practical ingenuity of the servant community. The servants who had learned to deal with frozen waste disposal systems to maintain sanitary conditions in extreme cold and to prevent disease outbreaks had gained expertise that was essential for the health and survival of the entire castle population. The social innovations that had emerged during the winter months had created new forms of organization and cooperation that challenged the traditional hierarchies of medieval society. The survival committees that had formed around specific challenges, heat distribution, food preparation, medical care, fuel management had created new forms of leadership and authority that were based on practical skills and knowledge rather than inherited privilege. The psychological resilience that had been developed during the winter months had created new forms of mental strength and emotional stability that would influence the behavior and attitudes of the castle's inhabitants for years to come. The servants who had learned to maintain hope and sanity in seemingly impossible conditions had gained psychological resources that would serve them well in facing the other challenges of medieval life. The economic understanding that had developed during the winter months had created new appreciation for the value of careful planning, resource conservation, and efficient distribution. The servants who had learned to manage scarce resources effectively had gained knowledge that would be valuable in all aspects of castle life, from managing household budgets to planning for future emergencies. The legacy of the winter survival experience extended far beyond the immediate challenges of staying alive during the cold months. The social bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared hardship, the practical knowledge that had been developed through necessity, and the psychological resilience that had been gained through extreme challenge had created a form of human capital that would influence the development of medieval society for generations to come. The servants who had survived the winter in the stone fortress had proven that human beings could adapt to seemingly impossible conditions through cooperation, creativity, and mutual support. They had demonstrated that true nobility lay not in inherited privilege, but in the courage to face adversity, the wisdom to find solutions to complex problems, and the compassion to care for others in times of need. Their experience had created new forms of social understanding that would eventually challenge the fundamental assumptions of feudal society and contribute to the gradual transformation of medieval civilization. In the end, The seasonal struggle of winter nights in stone fortresses had revealed both the harsh realities of medieval life and the remarkable capacity of human beings to transcend their circumstances through community, creativity, and courage. The servants who had slept on frozen floors, who had shared their warmth and resources with others, and who had maintained their dignity and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, had created a legacy of human resilience that would inspire future generations to face their own challenges with similar courage and determination. In the pre-dawn darkness of a September morning in 1298, a small group of servants from Goodrich Castle made their way through the mist-shrouded wetlands that bordered the castle's eastern wall. Their destination was a marshy area where tall, slender plants called rushes grew in dense clusters, their green stalks reaching toward the pale sky like nature's own cathedral spires. This annual pilgrimage to harvest the rushes that would serve as the castle's primary bedding material for the coming year was far more than a simple gathering expedition. It was a complex undertaking that required specialized knowledge, careful timing, and skilled craftsmanship that had been passed down through generations of servants. The rush harvest was a critical event in the castle's seasonal cycle, one that would determine the comfort and health of hundreds of inhabitants throughout the long months ahead. The quality of the rushes, the skill with which they were prepared, and the care taken in their installation would make the difference between tolerable sleeping conditions and a winter of misery. That could literally mean the difference between life and death for the castle's most vulnerable inhabitants. The servants who had been selected for this crucial task were not chosen randomly, but represented the culmination of years of training and experience in the subtle arts of rush cultivation, harvest, and preparation. At the head of this small group was an elderly woman named Margot, whose knowledge of rushes was legendary throughout the castle. She had been overseeing the rush harvest for more than 30 years, and her expertise encompassed not only the technical aspects of cutting and preparing the plants, but also the deeper wisdom of understanding how different types of rushes would perform under various conditions of use. The rushes themselves were remarkable plants that had evolved to thrive in the challenging conditions of medieval wetlands. These tall, hollow-stemmed plants possessed characteristics that made them ideal for use as floor coverings and bedding materials. Their structure allowed them to compress under weight while still maintaining enough resilience to provide a barrier between human bodies and the cold, hard surfaces of castle floors. Their natural moisture-wicking properties helped absorb the dampness that was a constant problem in stone structures, while their hollow interiors provided insulation that could trap small pockets of warm air. The timing of the rush harvest was crucial to ensuring the quality of the final product. The plants had to be cut at exactly the right stage of their growth cycle, when their cellular structure would provide maximum durability and comfort while minimizing the risk of rot and decay. Too early, and the rushes would be too soft and would quickly break down under the stress of use. Too late, and they would be too rigid and brittle to provide adequate comfort. Margot's ability to determine the perfect moment for harvest was based on decades of experience reading the subtle signs of plant maturity that were invisible to untrained eyes. The process of cutting the rushes required specialized tools and techniques that had been developed over centuries of practice. The servants used sharp, curved knives that could slice cleanly through the tough stems, without crushing the delicate internal structure that gave the plants their useful properties. Each cut had to be made at precisely the right angle and height to ensure that the rushes would lie flat when installed while maintaining their ability to provide cushioning and insulation. The selection of individual rushes was a skill that required intimate knowledge of plant biology and practical experience with how different types of rushes would perform under various conditions. Margot could determine at a glance which rushes would provide the best cushioning for sleeping areas, which would be most effective for high-traffic zones, and which should be reserved for areas where moisture absorption was the primary concern. This knowledge was the result of years of observation and experimentation that had taught her to read the subtle differences in color, texture, and flexibility that indicated the quality and suitability of each plant. The harvest itself was backbreaking. Work that required the servants to spend hours bent over in the muddy, insect-infested wetlands, cutting rushes one by one and bundling them into manageable loads. The physical demands of this work were severe, requiring strength, endurance, and the ability to maintain precision and attention to detail even when exhausted. The servants who performed this labor understood that their work was literally foundational to the comfort and health of the entire castle population. The transportation of the harvested rushes back to the castle was a logistical challenge that required careful planning and execution. The fresh rushes were heavy and awkward to handle, and they had to be moved quickly to prevent damage from exposure to wind and sun. The servants had developed a system of bundles and carriers that allowed them to transport large quantities of rushes efficiently while maintaining the quality of the material. The initial processing of the rushes began immediately upon their arrival at the castle. The rushes had to be cleaned of mud, insects, and other debris that had accumulated during harvest and transport. This cleaning process was time-consuming and labor-intensive, requiring the servants to examine each rush individually and remove any damaged or inferior specimens. The standards for this selection process were extremely high, as a single poor-quality rush could compromise the effectiveness of an entire sleeping area. The drying process was perhaps the most critical stage in the preparation of the rushes. For use, the plants had to be dried thoroughly to prevent rot and mold, but the drying had to be controlled to preserve the flexibility and resilience that made them effective as bedding materials. The servants had developed sophisticated techniques for arranging the rushes in drying areas that provided adequate air circulation while protecting them from rain and excessive sunlight that could make them brittle. The storage of the dried rushes required specialized facilities that could protect the valuable materials from moisture, pests, and other threats while keeping them accessible for the daily maintenance and replacement that was necessary throughout the year. The castle's rush storage areas were carefully designed spaces that reflected the importance of these materials to the daily life of the castle. These storage areas had to be dry, well ventilated, and secure, and they required constant monitoring to ensure that the rushes remained in good condition. The weaving of rush mats was a skilled craft that required years of training to master. The servants who specialized in this work had to understand not only the technical aspects of weaving, but also the specific requirements of different areas within the castle. The mats used in the Great Hall had to be woven differently from those used in the cellars, and the mats intended for the Lord's chambers required different techniques from those used in the servants' quarters. The preparation of loose rushes for floor strewing was equally specialized work that required understanding of how the rushes would behave when scattered on different types of floors and under various conditions of use. The servants had to consider factors such as the expected foot traffic, the moisture levels in different areas of the castle, and the specific needs of the people who would be using these spaces. The rushes used in sleeping areas had to be prepared differently from those used in work areas, and the mixture of herbs and other materials that were added to the rushes had to be tailored to the specific functions of each space. The seasonal variations in rush preparation reflected the complex relationship between the natural cycles of plant growth and the human needs of castle life. The rushes harvested in early autumn would be used for the most demanding applications, while those gathered at other times of year would be reserved for less critical uses. The servants who managed the rush supply had to plan carefully to ensure that the highest quality materials were available when they were most needed. The social aspects of rush preparation were as important as the technical requirements. The work of harvesting, processing, and installing rushes was a communal activity that brought together servants from all levels of the castle hierarchy. The knowledge and skills required for this work were passed down through informal apprenticeships and shared experiences that created bonds of mutual respect and cooperation among the workers. The economic value of rushes in medieval castle life was enormous, though this value was rarely recognized in formal economic terms. The time and labor required to harvest, process, and install rushes represented a significant investment of resources that was essential to the functioning of the castle. The servants who possessed the specialized knowledge and skills required for rush management held positions of real importance within the castle hierarchy, though their contributions were often taken for granted by their social superiors. The question that emerges from this examination of the rush harvest is not merely how these materials were prepared and used, but how the complex knowledge and skills required for their management were preserved and transmitted through generations of servants. Possessed little formal education, but had developed sophisticated understanding of plant biology, materials, science, and human comfort that rivaled the theoretical knowledge of their more educated contemporaries. The answer to how such sophisticated knowledge is preserved and transmitted lies in understanding the elaborate informal education systems that existed within medieval castle servant communities. The knowledge of rush management was not contained in written texts or formal lectures, but was embedded in a complex network of master-apprentice relationships, seasonal rituals, and practical demonstrations that created a living library of botanical and material science, knowledge that was far more comprehensive than any formal academic curriculum of the time, the apprenticeship system that governed. Rush management was remarkably sophisticated, involving multiple levels of training that could extend over many years. Young servants would begin their education by observing the harvest and processing activities, gradually taking on simple tasks under the close supervision of experienced workers. This initial exposure was not merely about learning practical skills, but about developing the observational abilities and intuitive understanding that were essential for success in this demanding craft. Margot, the elderly woman who supervised the rush harvest, had herself begun her education as a child of 7, when she was first brought to the wetlands to help with the bundling and transportation of harvested rushes. Her training had progressed through clearly defined stages, each building upon the knowledge and skills acquired in the previous phase. By the time she was 12, she could identify the best rushes by touch and appearance. By 15, she could determine the optimal harvest timing for different types of rushes. By 20, she was skilled in all aspects of rush preparation and installation. By 30, she had developed the deeper understanding of plant biology and material science that allowed her to innovate and improve upon traditional techniques. The transmission of this knowledge involved sophisticated pedagogical techniques that were perfectly adapted to the learning styles and capabilities of people who possessed little formal education but had highly developed practical intelligence. The experienced workers used storytelling, demonstration, and hands-on practice to convey complex information about plant biology, seasonal cycles, and material science in ways that were easily understood and remembered. The knowledge was embedded in memorable narratives that connected technical information with practical applications and personal experiences. The seasonal nature of rush work created natural learning cycles that reinforced the educational process. The annual harvest provided regular opportunities for novice workers to observe and practice their skills under the guidance of experienced masters. The daily maintenance and replacement of rushes throughout the year provided continuous reinforcement of the knowledge and skills that had been acquired during the harvest season. The preparation for winter, when the quality of the rushes became literally a matter of life and death, provided additional motivation for mastering the most advanced techniques. The rush preparation process itself was a complex sequence of operations that required understanding of chemistry, physics, and biology that would have impressed contemporary scholars. The servants who managed this process had to understand how different drying techniques affected the cellular structure of the rushes, how various weaving patterns influenced the durability and comfort of the finished mats, and how the combination of rushes with different herbs and other materials could create specific beneficial effects. The selection and preparation of herbs to be mixed with the rushes was a specialized knowledge area that required understanding of botany, medicine, and aromatherapy that was far more advanced than the formal medical knowledge of the time. The servants who were skilled in this area could identify dozens of different plants and understand their specific properties and applications. They knew which herbs would repel insects, which would provide pleasant scents, which would help prevent disease, and which would promote restful sleep. This knowledge was acquired through years of experimentation and observation that created a practical understanding of plant chemistry that was remarkably accurate. The weaving techniques used to create rush mats were based on principles of materials, science, and engineering that were not formally understood until centuries later. The servants who mastered these techniques had developed an intuitive understanding of how different weaving patterns affected the strength, flexibility, and durability of the finished product. They could create mats that were optimized for specific applications, adjusting their techniques to produce materials that would perform well under the particular conditions of use they would encounter. The installation of rushes in different areas of the castle required understanding of physics and engineering that was applied through practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The servants who performed this work had to understand how air circulation patterns affected the moisture content of the rushes, how foot traffic patterns influenced wear and replacement schedules, and how the thermal properties of different areas of the castle affected the performance of the bedding materials. The maintenance of rush bedding throughout the year was a complex undertaking that required constant monitoring and adjustment to ensure optimal performance. The servants who were responsible for this work had to develop skills in diagnostics and problem solving that allowed them to identify and address issues before they became serious problems. They had to understand the signs of wear, moisture damage, pest infestation, and other problems that could compromise the effectiveness of the bedding materials. The quality control standards that governed rush preparation and installation were remarkably sophisticated, reflecting the critical importance of these materials to the health and comfort of the castle population. The servants who managed rush supplies had developed detailed criteria for evaluating the quality of materials at every stage of the process, from the initial harvest through the final installation. These standards were based on years of experience and observation that had taught them to recognize the subtle signs of quality and deficiency that would affect the performance of the finished product. The innovation and improvement of rush management techniques was an ongoing process that reflected the creative intelligence and problem-solving abilities of the servant community. The servants who worked with rushes were constantly experimenting with new techniques, materials, and applications that could improve the effectiveness of their work. These innovations were tested, refined, and shared through the informal networks that connected skilled workers throughout the castle and beyond. The social organization of rush work reflected the complex hierarchies and relationships that characterized medieval castle life. The servants who possessed the most advanced knowledge and skills occupied positions of respect and authority within the servant community, even though their social status remained officially low. The knowledge and skills they possessed gave them real power and influence that could be used to improve their conditions and advance their interests. The economic impact of skilled rush management was enormous, though it was rarely recognized. In formal economic terms, the servants who possessed advanced knowledge and skills in this area could literally make the difference between life and death for the castle population, particularly during the harsh winter months when the quality of the bedding materials was critical to survival. The value of their knowledge and skills was reflected in the respect and privileges they enjoyed within the servant community. The environmental knowledge that was required for successful rush management was remarkably sophisticated, involving understanding of ecology, hydrology, and climate that was based on decades of careful observation and experience. The servants who managed rush supplies had to understand the complex relationships between weather patterns, water levels, plant growth, and harvest timing that affected the availability and quality of their materials. This knowledge was acquired through years of patient observation and experience. That created a practical understanding of natural systems that was far more comprehensive than the theoretical knowledge of contemporary scholars. The preservation of rush management knowledge through times of social and economic upheaval was a crucial function of the servant community that ensured the continuity of these essential skills. The servants who possessed this knowledge understood its value and took steps to ensure that it would be passed on to future generations. This preservation effort involves not only the training of apprentices, but also the maintenance of the physical facilities and tools that were necessary for the work. The question that arises from this examination of the knowledge systems that governed rush management is how the sophisticated understanding of materials, science, plant biology, and human comfort that was embedded in these traditional practices influenced the development of formal scientific knowledge, and whether the practical wisdom of the servant community had lasting impact on the broader development of medieval civilization. The answer to how the practical wisdom of rush management influenced broader medieval civilization lies in understanding the complex pathways through which knowledge flowed between the servant community and the formal institutions of medieval society. The sophisticated understanding of materials, science, plant biology, and human comfort that was embedded in rush management practices did indeed have lasting impact on the development of medieval civilization. Though this influence was often indirect and rarely acknowledged by formal historical records, the knowledge systems that governed rush management were part of a broader network of practical wisdom that existed within medieval castle servant communities. This network included expertise in food preservation, textile production, construction techniques, herbal medicine, and dozens of other specialized areas that were essential to the functioning of medieval society. The servants who possessed this knowledge were not isolated specialists, but were part of interconnected communities that shared information, techniques, and innovations across geographical and social boundaries. The influence of rush management knowledge on medieval architecture and construction was particularly significant. The servants who understood the thermal properties of different materials, the importance of air circulation, and the principles of moisture control that were essential for successful rush installation also possessed knowledge that was valuable for the design and construction of buildings. This knowledge influenced the development of castle architecture, particularly in the design of sleeping quarters, storage areas, and other spaces where human comfort was important. The medical knowledge that was embedded in rush management practices had profound implications for the development of medieval healthcare. The servants who understood the medicinal properties of different herbs, the importance of cleanliness and sanitation, and the relationship between environmental conditions and human health possessed knowledge that was often more practical and effective than the theoretical medicine practiced by formally trained physicians. This knowledge influenced the development of folk medicine traditions that provided healthcare to the vast majority of medieval people who had no access to formal medical care. The botanical knowledge that was required for successful rush management contributed to the development of agricultural practices and plant cultivation techniques that were essential to medieval food production. The servants who understood plant biology, seasonal cycles, and the relationship between environmental conditions and plant growth possessed knowledge that was valuable for improving crop yields and developing new agricultural techniques. This knowledge was shared through the informal networks that connected castle servants with rural peasants and agricultural workers. The materials, science, knowledge that was embedded in rush management practices influenced the development of textile production, construction techniques, and other areas of medieval technology. The servants who understood the properties of different fibers, the principles of weaving and construction, and the relationship between structure and performance possessed knowledge that was valuable for improving the quality and durability of medieval manufactured goods. The environmental knowledge that was required for successful rush management contributed to the development of medieval understanding of ecology, climate, and natural systems. The servants who understood the complex relationships between weather patterns, water systems, plant growth, and animal behavior possessed knowledge that was valuable for improving agricultural practices, predicting weather patterns, and managing natural resources. This knowledge influenced the development of medieval environmental management practices that were essential to the sustainability of medieval civilization. The social impact of rush management knowledge was equally significant. The servants who possessed advanced knowledge and skills in this area occupied positions of respect and authority within their communities that allowed them to influence social organization and cultural development. The knowledge and skills they possessed gave them real power and influence that could be used to improve conditions for themselves and others, contributing to the gradual transformation of medieval social structures. The economic impact of rush management knowledge was enormous, though it was rarely recognized in formal economic terms. The servants who possessed advanced knowledge and skills in this area could literally make the difference between the success and failure of castle operations, particularly during times of crisis when the quality of basic materials and supplies was critical to survival. The value of their knowledge and skills was reflected in the respect and privileges they enjoyed within their care. We enjoyed within their cruising management knowledge through the medieval period was a crucial function of rush management knowledge through the medieval period was a crucial function of the servant community that ensured the continuity of these essential skills. The servants who possessed this knowledge understood its value and took active steps to ensure that it would be passed on to future generations. This preservation effort involved not only the training of apprentices, but also the maintenance of the physical facilities, tools, and materials that were necessary for the work. The innovation and improvement of rush management techniques was an ongoing process that reflected the creative intelligence and problem-solving abilities of the servant community. The servants who worked with rushes were constantly experimenting with new techniques, materials, and applications that could improve the effectiveness of their work. These innovations were tested, refined, and shared through the informal networks that connected skilled workers throughout medieval Europe. The cultural significance of rush management knowledge extended far beyond its practical applications. The rushes that covered the floors of medieval castles were not merely functional materials, but were part of a complex symbolic system that reflected medieval understanding of the relationship between humans and nature. The careful selection, preparation, and installation of rushes was a form of cultural expression that communicated values, beliefs, and social relationships that were central to medieval civilization. The artistic dimensions of rush management were also significant. The servants who were skilled in rush, weaving, and installation were artists who created beautiful and functional works that enhanced the aesthetic quality of medieval living spaces. The patterns, colors, and textures of rush mats and floor coverings were carefully designed to create pleasing visual effects that demonstrated the skill and creativity of their makers. The spiritual significance of rush management knowledge was reflected in the medieval understanding of work as a form of prayer and service. The servants who dedicated their lives to the careful preparation and installation of rushes were participating in a form of spiritual practice that connected them to the natural world and to the broader community of people who depended on their work. This spiritual dimension of their labor gave meaning and dignity to work that might otherwise have been seen as merely menial. The legacy of rush management knowledge extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing the development of modern understanding of materials, science, plant biology, and human comfort. The practical wisdom that was embedded in these traditional practices provided insights that were not formally understood until centuries later, when modern scientific methods finally validated the effectiveness of techniques that had been developed. Through centuries of practical experience and observation, the Rushmat Chronicles represent more than just the story of medieval bedding materials. They are a testament to the remarkable capacity of human beings to develop sophisticated knowledge and skills through patient observation, practical experience, and creative intelligence. The servants who dedicated their lives to the art of rush. Management were not merely laborers, but were scientists, artists, and innovators who made crucial contributions to the development of medieval civilization. In the end, the story of medieval rush management reveals the profound wisdom that can be found in the most humble and overlooked aspects of human experience. The servants who slept on rush mats, who spent their days harvesting and preparing these simple materials, and who passed their knowledge on to future generations, were participating in a form of human achievement that was no less remarkable than the great architectural and artistic accomplishments that are more commonly celebrated in medieval history. The Rushmat Chronicles remind us that true innovation and progress often come not from the formal institutions of learning and power, but from the practical wisdom of ordinary people who are willing to observe carefully, experiment patiently, and share their knowledge generously with others. The legacy of these medieval servants continues to influence our understanding of materials science, plant biology, and human comfort, proving that the most enduring forms of knowledge are often those that are rooted in the practical needs and experiences of everyday life. The shocking reality of sleeping on a castle floor was not merely a matter of physical discomfort, but was part of a complex system of knowledge, skill, and social organization that reveals the remarkable adaptability and resilience of the human spirit. The servants who mastered the art of rush management had created a form of civilization that was both practical and profound, both humble and sophisticated, both ancient and eternally relevant to the human experience of seeking comfort, security, and meaning in a challenging world.